This is the complete story of Napoleon, the entire Wikipedia article, narrated start to finish. Get comfortable and let's get into it. Napoleon Bonaparte, born Napoleone di Buonaparte, 15th August 1769, 5th May 1821, later known by his regnal name Napoleon I, was Emperor of the French from 18th May 1804 until his first abdication in 1814. With a brief restoration during the 100 Days in 1815. He rose to prominence as a general during the French Revolution and led a series of military campaigns across Europe and the Middle East during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. As a statesman, he implemented numerous legal and administrative reforms in France and Europe. Born on the island of Corsica to a family of Italian origin, Napoleon moved to mainland France in 1779 and was commissioned as an officer in the French Royal Army in 1785. He supported the French Revolution in 1789 and promoted its cause in Corsica. He rose rapidly through the ranks after winning the siege of Toulon in 1793 and defeating royalist insurgents in Paris on 13 Vendémiaire in 1795. In 1796, he commanded a military campaign against the Austrians and their Italian allies in the War of the First Coalition, scoring decisive victories and becoming a national hero. He led an invasion of Egypt and Syria in 1798, which served as a springboard for his rise to political power. In November 1799, Napoleon engineered the coup of 18 Brumaire against the French Directory and became first consul of the Republic. He won the Battle of Marengo in 1800, which secured France's victory in the War of the Second Coalition. And in 1803, he sold the territory of Louisiana to the United States. In December 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French, further consolidating his power. The breakdown of the Treaty of Amiens led to the War of the Third Coalition by 1805. Napoleon shattered the coalition with a decisive victory at the Battle of Austerlitz, which led to the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. In the War of the Fourth Coalition, Napoleon defeated Prussia at the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt in 1806, marched his Grande Armée into Eastern Europe, and defeated the Russians in 1807 at the Battle of Friedland. Seeking to extend his trade embargo against Britain, Napoleon invaded the Iberian Peninsula and installed his brother Joseph as King of Spain in 1808, provoking the Peninsular War. In 1809, the Austrians again challenged France in the War of the Fifth Coalition, during which Napoleon consolidated his dominance over Europe after winning the Battle of Wagram. In the summer of 1812, he launched an invasion of Russia. After forcing the Russians to abandon Moscow following the Battle of Borodino, Napoleon briefly occupied the city before conducting a catastrophic retreat of his army that winter. In 1813, Prussia and Austria joined Russia in the War of the Sixth Coalition, in which Napoleon was decisively defeated at the Battle of Leipzig. The coalition invaded France and captured Paris, forcing Napoleon to abdicate in April 1814. He was exiled to the Mediterranean island of Elba, and the House of Bourbons was restored to power. 10 months later, Napoleon escaped from Elba with around 1,000 men and marched on Paris, reclaiming control of the country. His opponents responded by forming a Seventh Coalition, which defeated him at the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815. Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he died of stomach cancer in 1821, aged 51. Napoleon is considered one of the greatest military commanders in history, and Napoleonic tactics are still studied at military schools worldwide. His legacy endures through the legal and administrative reforms he enacted in France and Western Europe, most notably the Napoleonic Code. He established a system of public education, abolished the vestiges of feudalism, emancipated Jews and other religious minorities, abolished the Spanish Inquisition, enacted the principle of equality before the law for an emerging middle class, and centralized state power at the expense of religious authorities. His conquests also acted as a catalyst for political change and the development of nation-states. However, he remains controversial because of his role in wars that devastated Europe, his looting of conquered territories, and his mixed record on civil rights. He abolished the free press, ended directly elected representative government, exiled and imprisoned critics of his regime, reinstated slavery in French colonies, banned the entry of black people and mulattoes into France, reduced the civil rights of women and children, reintroduced a hereditary monarchy and nobility, and violently repressed popular uprisings against his rule. Early life. Napoleon's family was of Italian origin. His paternal ancestors, the Buonapartes, descended from a minor Tuscan noble family who emigrated to Corsica in the 16th century. His maternal ancestors, the Ramolinos, descended from a noble family from Lombardy. Napoleon's parents, Carlo Maria Buonaparte and Maria Letizia Ramolino, lived in the Maison Bonaparte in Ajaccio, where Napoleon was born on 15th August 1769. He had an elder brother, Joseph, and 6 younger siblings, Lucien, Elisa, Louis, Pauline, Caroline, and Jérôme. 5 more siblings were stillborn or did not survive infancy. Napoleon was baptized as a Catholic under the name Napoleone di Buonaparte. In his youth, his name was also spelled as Napoleone, Nabulio, Napoleone, and Napoleone. Napoleon was born 1 year after the Republic of Genoa ceded Corsica to France through the Treaty of Versailles. His father supported Pasquale Paoli during the Corsican War of Independence against France. After the Corsican defeat at the Battle of Ponte Novo in 1769 and Paoli's exile to Britain, Carlo became friends with the French governor, Charles-Louis de Marbeuf, who became his patron and a godfather to Napoleon. With Marbeuf's support, Carlo was named Corsican representative to the court of Louis XVI, and Napoleon obtained a royal bursary to a military academy in mainland France. The dominant influence of Napoleon's childhood was his mother, whose firm discipline restrained a rambunctious child. Later in life, Napoleon said, "The future destiny of the child is always the work of the mother." Napoleon's noble, moderately affluent background afforded him greater opportunities to study than were available to a typical Corsican of the time. In January 1779, aged 9, Napoleon moved to the French mainland and enrolled at a religious school in Autun to improve his French, his mother tongues being Corsican and Italian. Although he eventually became fluent in French, he spoke it with a Corsican accent, and his French spelling was poor. In May, he transferred to the military academy at Brienne-le-Château, where he was routinely bullied by his peers for his accent, birthplace, short stature, mannerisms, and poor French. He became reserved and melancholic, applying himself to reading. An examiner observed that Napoleon has always been distinguished for his application in mathematics. He is fairly well acquainted with history and geography. This boy would make an excellent sailor. One story of Napoleon at the school is that he led junior students to victory against senior students in a snowball fight, which allegedly showed his leadership abilities. But the story was only told after Napoleon had become famous. In his later years at Brienne, Napoleon became an outspoken Corsican nationalist and admirer of Paoli. In September 1784, Napoleon was admitted to the École Militaire in Paris, where he trained to become an artillery officer. He excelled at mathematics and read widely in geography, history, and literature. However, he was poor at French and German. His father's death in February 1785 cut the family income and forced him to complete the 2-year course in 1 year. In September, he was examined by the famed scientist Pierre-Simon Laplace and became the first Corsican to graduate from the École Militaire. Early career, returned to Corsica. Upon graduating in September 1785, Bonaparte was commissioned as second lieutenant in La Fère Artillery Regiment. Bonaparte served in Valence and Auxonne until after the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, but spent long periods of leave in Corsica, which fed his Corsican nationalism. In September 1789, he returned to Corsica and promoted the French revolutionary cause. Paoli returned to the island in July 1790, but he had no sympathy for Bonaparte, as he deemed his father a traitor for having deserted the cause of Corsican independence. Bonaparte plunged into a complex 3-way struggle among royalists, revolutionaries, and Corsican nationalists. He became a supporter of the Jacobins and joined the pro-French Corsican Republicans, who opposed Paoli's policy and his aspirations to secede. He was given command over a battalion of Corsican volunteers and promoted to captain in the regular army in 1792, despite exceeding his leave of absence and a dispute between his volunteers and the French garrison in Ajaccio. In February 1793, Bonaparte took part in the failed French expedition to Sardinia. Following allegations that Paoli had sabotaged the expedition and that his regime was corrupt and incompetent, the French National Convention outlawed him. In early June, Bonaparte and 400 French troops failed to capture Ajaccio from Corsican volunteers, and the island came under the control of Paoli's supporters. When Bonaparte learned that the Corsican Assembly had condemned him and his family, the Bonapartes fled to Toulon on the French mainland. Siege of Toulon. Bonaparte returned to his regiment in Nice and was made captain of a coastal battery. In July 1793, he published a pamphlet, Le Souper de Beaucaire, Supper at Beaucaire, demonstrating his support for the National Convention, which was heavily influenced by the Jacobins. In September, with the help of his fellow Corsican Antoine Christophe Salicetti, Bonaparte was appointed artillery commander of the Republican forces sent to recapture the port of Toulon, which was occupied by Allied forces. He quickly increased the available artillery and proposed a plan to capture a hill fort where Republican guns could dominate the city's harbour and force the Allies to evacuate. The successful assault on the position on 16 to 17 December led to the capture of the city. Toulon brought Bonaparte to the attention of powerful men, including Augustin Robespierre, the younger brother of Maximilien Robespierre, a leading Jacobin. He was promoted to brigadier general and put in charge of defences on the Mediterranean coast. In February 1794, he was made artillery commander of the Army of Italy and devised plans to attack the Kingdom of Sardinia. The French army carried out Bonaparte's plan in the Second Battle of Sargeau in April 1794, and then advanced to seize Ormea in the mountains. From Ormea it headed west to outflank the Austro-Sardinian positions around Sargeau. After this campaign, Augustin Robespierre sent Bonaparte on a mission to the Republic of Genoa to determine the country's intentions towards France. 13. Vendémiaire. After the fall of Maximilien Robespierre in July 1794, Bonaparte's association with leading Jacobins made him politically suspect to the new regime. He was arrested on 9th of August, but released 2 weeks later. He was asked to draw up plans to attack Italian positions as part of France's war with Austria, and in March 1795, he took part in an expedition to take back Corsica from the British, but the French were repulsed by the Royal Navy. From 1794, Bonaparte was in a romantic relationship with Désirée Clary, whose sister Julie Clary had married Bonaparte's elder brother Joseph. In April 1795, Bonaparte was assigned to the Army of the West, which was engaged in the war in the Vendée, a civil war and royalist counter-revolution in the Vendée region. As an infantry command, it was a demotion from artillery general, and he pleaded poor health to avoid the posting. During this period, he wrote the romantic novella Clisson et Eugénie, about a soldier and his lover, in a clear parallel to Bonaparte's own relationship with Clary. In August, he obtained a position with the Bureau of Topography, where he worked on military planning. On 15th of September, he was removed from the list of generals in regular service for refusing to serve in the Vendée campaign. He sought a transfer to Constantinople to offer his services to Sultan Selim III. The request was eventually granted, but he never took up the post. On 3rd of October, royalists in Paris declared a rebellion against the National Convention. Paul Barras, a leader of the Thermidorian reaction, knew of Bonaparte's military exploits at Toulon and made him second in command of the forces defending the convention in the Tuileries Palace. Bonaparte had seen the massacre of the King's Swiss Guard during the insurrection of 10th August 1792, there 3 years earlier, and realized that artillery would be the key to its defense. He ordered a young cavalry officer, Joachim Murat, to seize cannons, and Bonaparte deployed them in key positions. On 5th of October 1795, 13 Vendémiaire en Haif, in the French Republican calendar, he fired on the rebels with canister rounds, described by Thomas Carlyle as the whiff of grape shot. About 300 to 1,400 rebels died in the uprising. Bonaparte's role in defeating the rebellion earned him and his family the patronage of the new government, the French Directory. On 26th October, he was promoted to commander of the Army of the Interior, and in January 1796, he was appointed head of the Army of Italy. Within weeks of the Vendémiaire uprising, Bonaparte was romantically involved with Joséphine de Beauharnais, the former mistress of Barras. Joséphine had been born in the French colonies in the Lesser Antilles, and her family owned slaves on sugar plantations. The couple married on 9th March 1796 in a civil ceremony. Bonaparte began to habitually style himself Napoleon Bonaparte, rather than using the Italian form Napoleone di Buonaparte. First Italian campaign. 2 days after the marriage, Bonaparte left Paris to take command of the Army of Italy. He went on the offensive, hoping to defeat the Kingdom of Sardinia in Piedmont before their Austrian allies could intervene. In a series of victories during the Montenotte campaign, he knocked the Piedmontese out of the war in 2 weeks. The French then focused on the Austrians, laying siege to Mantua. The Austrians launched offensives against the French to break the siege, but Bonaparte defeated every relief effort, winning the Battle of Castiglione, the Battle of Bassano, the Battle of Arcole, and the Battle of Rivoli. The French triumph at Rivoli in January 1797 led to the collapse of the Austrian position in Italy. At Rivoli, Austria lost 43% of its soldiers dead, wounded, or taken prisoner. The French then invaded the heartlands of the House of Habsburg. French forces in southern Germany had been defeated by Archduke Charles, Duke of Teschen, in 1796, but Charles withdrew his forces to protect Vienna after learning of Bonaparte's assault. In their first encounter, Bonaparte pushed Charles back and advanced deep into Austrian territory after winning the Battle of Tarvis in March 1797. Alarmed by the French thrust that reached Leoben, about 100 kilometers from Vienna, the Austrians sued for peace. The preliminary Peace of Leoben, signed on 18th April, gave France control of most of northern Italy and the Low Countries and promised to partition the Republic of Venice with Austria. Bonaparte marched on Venice and forced its surrender, ending 1,100 years of Venetian independence. He authorized the French to loot treasures such as the horses of St. Mark. In this Italian campaign, Bonaparte's army captured 150,000 prisoners, 540 cannons, and 170 standards. The French army fought 67 actions and won 18 pitched battles through superior artillery technology and Bonaparte's tactics. Bonaparte extracted an estimated 45 million French pounds from Italy during the campaign, another 12 million pounds in precious metals and jewels, and more than 300 paintings and sculptures. During the campaign, Bonaparte became increasingly influential in French politics. He founded 2 newspapers, one for the troops in his army and one for circulation in France. The royalists attacked him for looting Italy and warned that he might become a dictator. Bonaparte sent General Charles-Pierre Augereau to Paris to support a coup d'état that purged royalists from the legislative councils on 4th September, the coup of 18 Fructidor. This left Barras and his Republican allies in control again, but more dependent upon Bonaparte, who finalized peace terms with Austria by the Treaty of Campo Formio. Bonaparte returned to Paris on 5th December 1797 as a hero. He met Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, France's foreign minister, and took command of the Army of England for the planned invasion of Britain. Egyptian expedition. After 2 months of planning, Bonaparte decided that France's naval strength was not yet sufficient to confront the Royal Navy. He decided on a military expedition to seize Egypt and thereby undermine Britain's access to its trade interests in India. Bonaparte wished to establish a French presence in the Middle East and join forces with Tipu Sultan, the Sultan of Mysore, an enemy of the British. Bonaparte assured the Directory that, as soon as he had conquered Egypt, he will establish relations with the Indian princes and, together with them, attack the English in their possessions. The Directory agreed in order to secure a trade route to the Indian subcontinent. In May 1798, Bonaparte was elected a member of the French Academy of Sciences. His Egyptian expedition included a group of 167 scientists, with mathematicians, naturalists, chemists, and geodesists among them. Their discoveries included the Rosetta Stone, and their work was published in the Description de l'Égypte in 1809. En route to Egypt, Bonaparte reached Hospitalet Malta on 9th of June 1798, then controlled by the Knights Hospitaller. Grand Master Ferdinand von Hompesch zu Bolheim surrendered after token resistance, and Bonaparte captured an important naval base with the loss of only 3 men. Bonaparte and his expedition eluded pursuit by the Royal Navy and landed at Alexandria on 1st July. He fought the Battle of Shubra Khit against the Mamluks, Egypt's ruling military caste. This helped the French practice their defensive tactic for the Battle of the Pyramids on 21st July, about 24 kilometers, 15 miles from the pyramids. Bonaparte's forces of 25,000 roughly equaled those of the Mamluks' Egyptian cavalry. 29 French and approximately 2,000 Egyptians were killed. The victory boosted the French army's morale. On 1st August 1798, the British fleet under Sir Horatio Nelson captured or destroyed all but 2 vessels of the French fleet in the Battle of the Nile, preventing Bonaparte from strengthening the French position in the Mediterranean. His army had succeeded in a temporary increase of French power in Egypt, though it faced repeated uprisings. In early 1799, he moved an army into the Ottoman province of Damascus, Syria, and Galilee. Bonaparte led these 13,000 French soldiers in the conquest of the coastal towns of Arish, Gaza, Jaffa, and Haifa. The attack on Jaffa was particularly brutal. Bonaparte discovered that many of the defenders were former prisoners of war, ostensibly on parole. So he ordered the garrison and some 105,000 prisoners to be executed by bayonet or drowning. Men, women, and children were robbed and murdered for 3 days. Bonaparte began with an army of 13,000 men. 1,500 were reported missing, 1,200 died in combat, and thousands perished from disease, mostly bubonic plague. He failed to reduce the fortress of Acre, so he marched his army back to Egypt in May. Bonaparte was alleged to have ordered plague-stricken men to be poisoned with opium to speed the retreat. Back in Egypt on 25 July, Bonaparte defeated an Ottoman amphibious invasion at Aboukir. Bonaparte stayed informed of European affairs. He learned that France had suffered a series of defeats in the War of the Second Coalition. On 24th of August 1799, fearing that the Republic's future was in doubt, he took advantage of the temporary departure of British ships from French coastal ports and set sail for France, despite the fact that he had received no explicit orders from Paris. The army was left in the charge of Jean-Baptiste Kléber, ruler of France. 18. Brumaire. Unknown to Bonaparte, the Directory had sent him orders to return from Egypt with his army to ward off a possible invasion of France. But these messages never arrived. By the time he reached Paris in October, France's situation had been improved by a series of victories. The Republic, however, was bankrupt, and the ineffective Directory was unpopular. Despite the failures in Egypt, Bonaparte returned to a hero's welcome. The Directory discussed Bonaparte's desertion, but was too weak to punish him. Bonaparte formed an alliance with Talleyrand and leading members of the Council of 500 and Directory, Lucien Bonaparte, Emmanuel Joseph Cas, Roger Ducos, and Joseph Fouché, to overthrow the government. On 9th November 1799, 18 Brumaire, according to the revolutionary calendar, the conspirators launched a coup, and the following day, backed by grenadiers with fixed bayonets, forced the Council of 500 to dissolve the Directory and appoint Bonaparte, Sieyès and Ducos provisional consuls, French Consulate. On 13th December, Bonaparte introduced the Constitution of the Year 8, under which 3 consuls were appointed for 10 years. Real power lay with Bonaparte as first consul, and his preferred candidates Cambacérès and Charles-François Lebrun were appointed as second and third consuls, who only had an advisory role. The Constitution also established a legislative body and tribunate, which were selected from indirectly elected candidates, and a Senate and Council of State, which were effectively nominated by the executive. The Constitution was approved by plebiscite on 7th of February 1800. The official count was over 3 million in favour and 1,562 against. Lucien, however, had doubled the count of the yes vote to give the false impression that a majority of those eligible to vote had approved the Constitution. Historians have variously described Bonaparte's regime as dictatorship by plebiscite, absolutist rule decked out in the spirit of the age, and soft despotism. Local and regional administration was reformed to concentrate power in the central government, censorship was introduced, and most opposition newspapers were closed down to stifle dissent. Royalist and regional revolts were dealt with by a combination of amnesties for those who lay down their arms and brutal repression of those who continued to resist. Bonaparte also improved state finances by securing loans under a promise to defend private property, raising taxes on tobacco, alcohol and salt, and extracting levies from France's satellite republics. Bonaparte believed that the best way to secure his regime was by a victorious peace. In May 1800, he led an army across the Swiss Alps into Italy, aiming to surprise the Austrian armies that had reoccupied the peninsula when Bonaparte was still in Egypt. After a difficult crossing over the Alps, the French captured Milan on 2nd June. The French confronted an Austrian army under Michael von Melas at the Battle of Marengo on 14th June. The Austrians fielded about 30,000 soldiers, while Bonaparte commanded 24,000 troops. The Austrians' initial attack surprised the French, who were gradually driven back. Late in the afternoon, however, a full division under French General Louis Desire arrived on the field and reversed the tide of the battle. The Austrian army fled, leaving behind 14,000 casualties. The following day, the Austrians signed an armistice and agreed to abandon northern Italy. When peace negotiations with Austria stalled, Bonaparte reopened hostilities in November. a French army under General Jean-Victor Marie Moreau swept through Bavaria and scored an overwhelming victory over the Austrians at the Battle of Hohenlinden in December. The Austrians capitulated and signed the Treaty of Luneville in February 1801. The treaty reaffirmed and expanded earlier French gains at Campo Formio. On 26th of January 1802, following the Consulate de Lyon, Napoleon was declared President of the Italian Republic. Bonaparte's triumph at Marengo increased his popularity and political authority. However, he still faced royalist plots and feared Jacobin influence, especially in the army. Several assassination plots, including the Conspiration des Poignards, dagger plot, in October 1800, and the plot of the Rue Saint-Nicaise 2 months later, gave him a pretext to arrest about 100 suspected Jacobins and royalists, some of whom were shot, and many others deported to penal colonies. Temporary peace in Europe. After a decade of war, France and Britain signed the Treaty of Amiens in March 1802, bringing the Revolutionary Wars to an end. Under the treaty, Britain agreed to withdraw from most of the colonies it had recently captured from France and her allies, and France agreed to evacuate Naples. In April, Bonaparte publicly celebrated the peace and his controversial Concordat of 1801 with Pope Pius VII, under which the Pope recognized Bonaparte's regime, and the regime recognized Catholicism as the majority religion of France. In a further step towards national reconciliation, known as fusion, Bonaparte offered an amnesty to most émigrés who wished to return to France. With Europe at peace and the economy recovering, Bonaparte became increasingly popular both domestically and abroad. In May 1802, the Council of State recommended a new plebiscite, asking the French people to make Napoleon Bonaparte consul for life. It was the first time his first name was officially used by the regime. About 3.6 million voted yes and 8,374 no. 40–60% of eligible Frenchmen voted, the highest turnout for a plebiscite since the Revolution. France had regained her overseas colonies under Amiens, but did not control them all. The French National Convention had voted to abolish slavery in February 1794, but in May 1802, Bonaparte reintroduced it in all the recovered colonies, except Saint-Domingue and Guadeloupe, which were under the control of rebel generals. A French military expedition under Antoine Richepanse regained control of Guadeloupe, and slavery was reintroduced there on 16th July. Saint-Domingue was the most profitable of the colonies, a major source of sugar, coffee, and indigo, but was under the control of the former slave Toussaint Louverture. Bonaparte sent the Saint-Domingue expedition under his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, to retake the colony, and they landed there in February 1802 with 29,000 men. Although Toussaint was captured and sent to France in July, the expedition ultimately failed due to high rates of disease and a string of defeats against rebel commander Jean-Jacques Dessalines. In May 1803, Bonaparte acknowledged defeat, and the last 8,000 French troops left the island. The former slaves proclaimed the independent Republic of Haiti in 1804. As war with Britain again loomed in 1803, Bonaparte realized that his American colony of Louisiana would be difficult to defend. In need of funds, he agreed to the Louisiana Purchase with the United States, doubling the latter's size. The price was $15 million. The peace with Britain was uneasy. Britain did not evacuate Malta as promised, and protested against Bonaparte's annexation of Piedmont and his Act of Mediation, 19th February, which established a Swiss confederation. Neither of these territories were covered by Amiens, but they inflamed tensions significantly, as did Bonaparte's occupation of Holland and apparent ambitions in India. The dispute culminated in a declaration of war by Britain in May 1803. Bonaparte responded by reassembling the invasion camp at Boulogne and ordering the arrest of every British male between 18 and 60 years old in France and its dependencies as a prisoner of war. French Empire. Bonaparte becomes Napoleon III. In February 1804, Bonaparte's police made a series of arrests in relation to a royalist plot to kidnap or assassinate him that involved the British government, Moreau, and an unnamed Bourbon prince. On the advice of his foreign minister, Talleyrand, Napoleon ordered the kidnapping of the Duke of Enghien, violating the sovereignty of Baden. The Duke was quickly executed after a secret military trial, even though there was no proof he had been involved in the plot. Enghien's kidnapping and execution infuriated royalists and monarchs throughout Europe and drew a formal protest from Russia. Following the royalist plot, Bonaparte's supporters convinced him to convert the consulate into a monarchy. They argued that the presence of an heir would help to secure the regime in case of his death. As well, they believed a monarchy would make Napoleon more acceptable to constitutional monarchists and put France on the same footing as other European monarchies. On 18th May, the Senate proclaimed Napoleon Emperor of the French and approved a new constitution. The following day, Napoleon appointed 18 of his leading generals marshals of the empire. The hereditary empire was confirmed by a plebiscite in June. The official result showed 3.5 million voted yes and 2,569 voted no. The yes count, however, was falsely inflated by 300,000 to 500,000 votes. The turnout, at 35%, was below the figure for the previous plebiscite. Britain, Russia, Sweden and the Ottoman Empire refused to recognize Napoleon's title. Austria, however, recognized Napoleon as Emperor of the French in return for his recognition of Francis I as Emperor of Austria. Napoleon's coronation, with the participation of Pope Pius VII, took place at Notre-Dame de Paris on 2 December 1804. After having been anointed by the Pope, Napoleon crowned himself with a replica of Charlemagne's crown. He then crowned Josephine, who became the second woman in French history, after Marie de Medici, to be crowned and anointed. He then swore an oath to defend the territory of the Republic, to respect the Concordat, freedom of worship, political and civil liberty, and the sale of nationalized lands, to raise no taxes except by law, to maintain the Legion of Honor, and to govern in the interests, well-being, and the glory of the French people. On 17th March 1805, Napoleon declared himself King of Italy and crowned himself with the Iron Crown of Lombardy at the Cathedral of Milan. Austria saw this as a provocation because of its own territorial interests in Italy. When Napoleon incorporated Genoa and Liguria into his empire, Austria formally protested against this violation of the Treaty of Lunéville. War of the Third Coalition. By September 1805, Sweden, Russia, Austria, Naples, and the Ottoman Empire had joined Britain in a coalition against France. In 1803 and 1804, Napoleon had assembled a force around Boulogne for an invasion of Britain. They never invaded, but the force formed the core of Napoleon's Grande Armée, created in August 1805. At the start, this French army had about 200,000 men organized into 7 corps, artillery and cavalry reserves, and the elite Imperial Guard. By August 1805, the Grande Armée had grown to a force of 350,000 men, who were well-equipped, well-trained, and led by competent officers. To facilitate the invasion, Napoleon planned to lure the Royal Navy from the English Channel by a diversionary attack on the British West Indies. However, the plan unraveled after the British victory at the Battle of Cape Finisterre in July 1805. French Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve retreated to Cadiz instead of linking up with French naval forces at Brest for an attack on the English Channel. Facing a potential invasion from his continental enemies, Napoleon abandoned his invasion of England and sought to destroy the isolated Austrian armies in southern Germany before their Russian ally could arrive in force. On 25 September, 200,000 French troops began to cross the Rhine on a front of 260 kilometers, 160 mi. Austrian commander Karl Mack von Leiberich had gathered most of the Austrian army at the fortress of Ulm in Swabia. Napoleon's army, however, moved quickly and outflanked the Austrian positions. After some minor engagements that culminated in the Battle of Ulm, Mack surrendered. With 2,000 French casualties, Napoleon had captured 60,000 Austrian soldiers through his army's rapid marching. For the French, this spectacular victory on land was soured by the decisive victory that the Royal Navy attained at the Battle of Trafalgar on 21st October. After Trafalgar, the Royal Navy was never again seriously challenged by Napoleon's fleet. French forces occupied Vienna in November, capturing 100,000 muskets, 500 cannons, and the intact bridges across the Danube. Napoleon then sent his army north in pursuit of the Allies. Tsar Alexander I of Russia and Francis I decided to engage Napoleon in battle, despite reservations from some of their subordinates. At the Battle of Austerlitz on 2 December, Napoleon deployed his army below the Pratzen Heights. He ordered his right wing to feign retreat, enticing the Allies to descend from the heights in pursuit. The French center and left wing then captured the heights and caught the Allies in a pincer movement. thousands of Russian troops fled across a frozen lake to escape the trap, and 100 to 2,000 of them drowned. About a third of the Allied forces were killed, captured, or wounded. The disaster at Austerlitz led Austria to seek an armistice. By the subsequent Treaty of Pressburg, signed on 26 December, Austria left the coalition, lost substantial territory to the Kingdom of Italy and Bavaria, and was forced to pay an indemnity of 40 million francs. Alexander's army was granted safe passage back to Russia. Napoleon went on to say, "The Battle of Austerlitz is the finest of all I have fought." Frank McLean suggests that Napoleon was so successful at Austerlitz that he lost touch with reality, and what used to be French foreign policy became a personal Napoleonic one. Vincent Cronin disagrees, stating that Napoleon was not overly ambitious for himself. He embodied the ambitions of 30 million Frenchmen. Middle Eastern alliances. Napoleon continued to entertain a grand scheme to establish a French presence in the Middle East in order to put pressure on Britain and Russia, possibly by forming an alliance with the Ottoman Empire. In February 1806, Ottoman Emperor Selim III recognized Napoleon as emperor. He also opted for an alliance with France, calling France our sincere and natural ally. That decision brought the Ottoman Empire into a losing war against Russia and Britain. A Franco-Persian alliance was formed between Napoleon and the Persian Empire of Fath Ali Shah Qajar. It collapsed in 1807 when France and Russia formed an unexpected alliance. In the end, Napoleon made no effective alliances in the Middle East. War of the Fourth Coalition and Tilsit. After Austerlitz, Napoleon increased his political power in Europe. In 1806, he deposed the Bourbon King of Naples and installed his elder brother Joseph on the throne. He then made his younger brother Louis King of Holland. On 12th July, he established the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states intended to serve as a buffer zone between France and Central Europe. The creation of the Confederation spelled the end of the Holy Roman Empire. Napoleon's growing influence in Germany threatened the status of Prussia as a great power, and in response, Frederick William III decided on war with France. Prussia and Russia signed a military alliance creating the Fourth Coalition against France. Prussia, however, committed a strategic blunder by declaring war when French troops were still in southern Germany and months before sufficient Russian troops could reach the front. Napoleon invaded Prussia with 180,000 troops, rapidly marching on the right bank of the River Saale. Upon learning the whereabouts of the Prussian army, the French swung westwards, thus cutting the Prussians off from Berlin and the slowly approaching Russians. At the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, fought on 14th October, the French convincingly defeated the Prussians and inflicted heavy casualties. With several major commanders dead or incapacitated, the Prussian king proved incapable of effectively commanding the army, which quickly disintegrated. In the following month, the French captured 140,000 soldiers and over 2,000 cannon. Despite their overwhelming defeat, the Prussians refused to negotiate with the French until the Russians had an opportunity to enter the fight. Following his triumph, Napoleon imposed the first elements of the Continental System through the Berlin Decree issued in November 1806. The Continental System, which prohibited European nations from trading with Britain, was widely violated throughout his reign. In the next few months, Napoleon marched against the advancing Russian armies through Poland and fought a bloody stalemate at the Battle of Eylau in February 1807. After a period of rest and consolidation on both sides, the war restarted in June with an initial struggle at Heilsberg that proved indecisive. On 14th June, Napoleon obtained an overwhelming victory over the Russians at the Battle of Friedland, inflicting casualties of up to 30% of the Russian army. The scale of their defeat convinced the Russians to make peace with the French. The two emperors began peace negotiations on 25 June at the town of Tilsit, during a meeting on a raft floating in the middle of the river Niemen, which separated the French and Russian troops and their respective spheres of influence. Napoleon offered Alexander relatively lenient terms, demanding that Russia join the Continental System, withdraw its forces from Wallachia and Moldavia, and hand over the Ionian Islands to France. In contrast, Prussia was treated harshly. It lost half its territory and population and underwent a 2-year occupation, costing it about 1.4 billion francs. From former Prussian territory, Napoleon created the Kingdom of Westphalia, ruled by his young brother Jerome, and the Duchy of Warsaw. Prussia's humiliating treatment at Tilsit caused lasting resentment against France in that country. The treaty was also unpopular in Russia, putting pressure on Alexander to end the alliance with France. Nevertheless, the treaties of Tilsit gave Napoleon a respite from war and allowed him to return to France, which he had not seen in over 300 days, Peninsular War and Erfurt. After Tilsit, Napoleon turned his attention to Portugal, which was reluctant to strictly enforce the blockade against its traditional ally Britain. On 17th of October 1807, 24,000 French troops under General Jean Andoche Junot crossed the Pyrenees with Spanish consent and headed towards Portugal to enforce the blockade. Junot occupied Lisbon in November. The Portuguese royal family had already fled to Brazil with the Portuguese fleet. In March 1808, a palace coup led to the abdication of the Spanish king, Carlos IV, in favor of his son Fernando VII. The following month, Napoleon summoned Carlos and Fernando to Bayonne, where in May, he forced them both to relinquish their claims to the Spanish throne. Napoleon then made his brother Joseph king of Spain. By then, there were 120,000 French troops garrisoned in the peninsula, and widespread Spanish opposition to the occupation and the overthrow of the Spanish Bourbons. On 2nd May, an uprising against the French broke out in Madrid and spread throughout Spain in the following weeks. In the face of brutal French repression, the uprising developed into a sustained conflict. Joseph traveled to Madrid, where he was proclaimed King of Spain on 24th July. However, following news of a French defeat by regular Spanish forces at the Battle of Bailén, Joseph fled Madrid several days later. The following month, a British force landed in Portugal, and on 21st August, they defeated the French at the Battle of Vimeiro. Under the Convention of Sintra, the French evacuated Portugal. The defeats at Bailén and Vimeiro convinced Napoleon that he had to take command of the Iberian campaign. Before leaving for Spain, he attempted to strengthen the alliance with Russia and obtain a commitment from Alexander that Russia would declare war on Austria if she attacked France. At the Congress of Erfurt in October 1808, Napoleon and Alexander reached an agreement that recognized the Russian conquest of Finland and called upon Britain to cease its war against France. However, Alexander failed to provide a firm commitment to make war with Austria. On 6 November, Napoleon was in Vitoria and took command of 240,000 French-led troops. After a series of victories over Anglo-Spanish forces, they retook Madrid on 4th December. Napoleon then pursued a retreating British army, which was eventually evacuated at Corunna in January 1809. He left for France on 17th January, leaving Joseph in command. Napoleon never returned to Spain after the 1808 campaign. In April, the British sent another army to the peninsula under Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. British, Portuguese, and Spanish troops engaged the French in a protracted series of conflicts, while a brutal guerrilla war engulfed much of the Spanish countryside, a conflict in which atrocities were committed by both sides. Napoleon later called the Peninsular Campaign the unlucky war that ruined me. It tied up some 300,000 French-led troops from 1808 to 1812. By 1814, the French had been driven from the peninsula with over 150,000 casualties in the campaign. War of the Fifth Coalition. The overthrow of the Spanish Bourbons caused alarm in Austria over Napoleon's ambitions, while France's military difficulties in the peninsula encouraged Austria to go to war. In the early morning of 10th of April 1809, the Austrian army crossed the Inn River and invaded Bavaria. The Austrian advance was disorganized, and they were unable to defeat the Bavarian army before the French could concentrate their forces. Napoleon arrived from Paris on 17th April to lead the French campaign. In the following Battle of Eckmühl, he was slightly wounded in the heel, but the Austrians were forced to retreat across the Danube. The French occupied Vienna on 13th May, but most of the population had fled, and the retreating army had destroyed all 4 bridges across the river. On 21st May, the French attempted to cross the Danube, precipitating the Battle of Aspern-Essling. Both sides inflicted about 23,000 casualties on each other, and the French were forced back. The battle was reported in European capitals as a defeat for Napoleon and damaged his aura of invincibility. After 6 weeks of preparations, Napoleon made another attempt at crossing the Danube. In the ensuing Battle of Wagram, 5 to 6th of July, the Austrians were forced to retreat, but the French and Austrians each suffered losses of 37,000 to 39,000 killed, wounded, or captured. The French caught up with the retreating Austrians at the Battle of Znaim on 10th July. and the latter signed an armistice on 12th July. In August, a British force landed in Holland but lost 4,000 men, mainly to illness, before withdrawing in December. The Treaty of Schönbrunn in October 1809 was harsh for Austria, which lost substantial territory and over 3 million subjects. France received Carinthia, Carniola, and the Adriatic ports of Trieste and Fiume, Rijeka. The part of Poland annexed by Austria in the Third Partition in 1795, known at the time as West Galicia, was given to the Polish-ruled Duchy of Warsaw, and the territory of the former Archbishopric of Salzburg went to Bavaria. Austria was required to pay an indemnity of 200 million francs, and its army was reduced to 150,000 men. Consolidation of the empire. Napoleon's union with Josephine had not produced a child, and he decided to secure the dynasty and strengthen its position in Europe by a strategic marriage into one of Europe's major royal houses. In November 1809, he announced his decision to divorce Josephine, and the marriage was annulled in January 1810. Napoleon had already commenced negotiations for the marriage of Tsar Alexander's sister Anna, but the Tsar responded that she was too young. Napoleon then turned to Austria, and a marriage to the Austrian Emperor's daughter, Marie-Louise, was quickly agreed. The marriage was formalized in a civil ceremony on 1st April and a religious service at the Louvre on the following day. The marriage to Marie-Louise was widely seen as a shift in French policy towards stronger ties with Austria and away from the already strained relationship with Russia. On 20th of March 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to the heir apparent, François Charles Joseph Napoleon, King of Rome. With the annexation of the Papal States, May 1809, February 1810, Holland, July 1810, and the northern coastal regions of Westphalia, August 1810, mainland France further increased its territory. Napoleon now ruled about 40% of the European population, either directly or indirectly, through his satellite kingdoms. Invasion of Russia. Tsar Alexander saw the creation of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, Napoleon's marriage alliance with Austria, and the election of the French Marshal Jean-Baptiste Jules Bernadotte as Crown Prince of Sweden as attempts to contain Russia. In December 1810, Napoleon annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, which Alexander considered an insult as his uncle was the Duke. Alexander responded by allowing neutral shipping into Russian ports and banning most French imports. Russia feared that Napoleon intended to restore the Kingdom of Poland, while Napoleon suspected Russia of seeking an alliance with Britain against France. In late 1811, Napoleon began planning an invasion of Russia. A Franco-Prussian alliance signed in February 1812 forced Prussia to provide 20,000 troops for the invasion, and in March, Austria agreed to provide 30,000 men. Napoleon's multinational Grande Armée comprised around 450,000 frontline troops, of which about a third were native French speakers. Napoleon called the invasion the Second Polish War, but he refused to guarantee an independent Poland for fear of alienating his Austrian and Prussian allies. On 24 June, Napoleon's troops began crossing the Niemen River into Russian Lithuania, with the aim of luring the Russians into 1 or 2 decisive battles. The Russians retreated 320 kilometers east to the Dvina River and implemented a scorched earth policy, making it increasingly difficult for the French to forage food for themselves and their horses. On 18th August, Napoleon captured Smolensk with the loss of 9,000 of his men, but the Russians were able to withdraw in good order. The Russians, commanded by Field Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov, made a stand at Borodino outside Moscow on 7 September. The battle resulted in 44,000 Russian and 35,000 French dead, wounded, or captured, in one of the bloodiest days of battle in Europe up to that time. The Russians withdrew overnight, and Napoleon later stated, "The most terrible of all my battles was the one before Moscow. The French showed themselves worthy of victory, and the Russians worthy of being invincible." The Russians retreated to Tarutino, and Napoleon entered Moscow on 14th September. The following evening, the city was set on fire on the orders of Governor Fyodor Rostopchin. Alexander, in St. Petersburg, refused to negotiate a peace, and after 6 weeks, Napoleon's army evacuated Moscow. After capturing Maloyaroslavets with the loss of 4,000 to 10,000 men, Napoleon retreated towards Smolensk. The French were attacked by Cossacks and peasants and suffered from the intense cold, disease, and lack of food and water. Around 40,000 to 50,000 troops reached Smolensk on 9 November, a loss of about 60,000 in 3 weeks. Napoleon also heard that an attempted coup by General Claude François de Mallet in Paris had only narrowly failed. From Smolensk, Napoleon's army headed for Vilnius, where there was a French garrison of 20,000. In late November, under attack from all sides by Russian forces, the Grande Armée managed to cross the Berezina River on pontoon bridges in temperatures reaching 40 degrees. On 5th December, shortly before arriving in Vilnius, Napoleon left his disintegrating army for Paris. In the following weeks, the remnants of the Grande Armée, about 75,000 troops, crossed the Niemen into Allied territory. Russian military losses in the campaign were up to 300,000, and total military deaths from both sides were up to 1 million. War of the Sixth Coalition. The French, pursued by the Russians, withdrew from most of Poland and Prussia over the winter of 1812-13, while both sides rebuilt their forces. Sweden and Prussia declared war on France in March 1813. In April, Napoleon assumed command of an army of 200,000 troops and defeated the coalition at the battles of Lutzen and Bautzen. Britain formally joined the coalition in June, followed by Austria in August, but the Allies were again defeated in the Battle of Dresden in August. The coalition, however, had a growing advantage in infantry, cavalry, reserves, and armaments. In the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars, the coalition was victorious at the Battle of Leipzig, 19th October. Although coalition casualties were 54,000 men, the French lost 38,000 killed or wounded and 15,000 taken prisoner. Up to 50,000 more were lost to death, illness, and desertion during the French retreat to the Rhine. The Frankfurt proposals were peace terms offered by the coalition in November 1813, under which Napoleon would remain emperor, but France would be reduced to its natural frontiers. That meant that France would retain control of Belgium, Savoy, and the west bank of the Rhine, while withdrawing from Spain, Holland, Italy, and Germany. Napoleon did not accept the terms, and the Allies crossed the Rhine into French territory on 1st of January 1814. Wellington's British forces had already crossed the Pyrenees into southwestern France. In northeastern France, Napoleon led about 70,000 troops against a coalition army of 200,000. After a defeat at the Battle of La Rothière, the French won a series of victories in February, which induced the coalition to offer peace on the basis of France's 1791 frontiers. Napoleon, however, decided to fight on. After a series of battles in March, the Allies forced Napoleon to retreat at the Battle of Arcis-sur-Aube, 2021 March. The coalition then moved towards Paris, whose defense was under the command of Joseph Bonaparte. On 29 March, a coalition army of 200,000 began their attack on the Belleville and Montmartre heights. Empress Marie-Louise fled Paris that evening with her son, the King of Rome. With an army of only 38,000 to defend the capital, Joseph authorized the French Marshal Auguste de Marmont to capitulate on 31st March. The following day, the Allies accepted Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord as head of a provisional government. On 2nd April, the French Senate passed the Acte de déchéance de l'Empereur, which declared Napoleon deposed. Meanwhile, Napoleon was in Fontainebleau with an army of 40,000 to 60,000. He contemplated a march on Paris, but on 4th April, his senior commanders persuaded him to abdicate in favor of his son, with Marie-Louise as regent. Tsar Alexander, however, demanded an unconditional abdication, and Napoleon reluctantly complied on 6th April. In his farewell address to the soldiers of the Old Guard on 20th April, Napoleon said, "Soldiers of my Old Guard, I have come to bid you farewell. For 20 years you have accompanied me faithfully on the paths of honor and glory. With men like you, our cause was not lost, but the war would have dragged on interminably, and it would have been a civil war. So, I am sacrificing our interests to those of our country. Do not lament my fate. If I have agreed to live on, it is to serve our glory. I wish to write the history of the great deeds we have done together. Farewell, my children." Exile to Elba. With the Treaty of Fontainebleau of 11th of April 1814, the Allies exiled Napoleon to Elba, an island of 12,000 inhabitants in the Mediterranean, 10 kilometers and 6 miles off the Tuscan coast, where they made him sovereign. The following night, Napoleon attempted suicide with poison he had carried after nearly being captured by the Russians during the retreat from Moscow. Its potency had weakened with age, however, and he survived to be exiled, while his wife and son took refuge in Austria. He was conveyed to the island on HMS Undaunted and disembarked at Portoferraio on 4th May. In the first few months on Elba, he drew up plans for administrative reforms, road and building works, and improvements to the island's mines and agriculture, but results were limited by lack of funds. When Napoleon learned that Josephine had died in France on 29th May, he was distraught and locked himself in his room for 2 days. Napoleon understood that French King Louis XVI was unpopular, realizing that his wife and son would not be joining him in exile. Cut off from the allowance guaranteed to him by the Treaty of Fontainebleau, and aware of rumors he was about to be banished to a remote island in the Atlantic Ocean, Napoleon escaped from Elba in the brig Inconstant on 26 February 1815 with about 1,000 men and a flotilla of 7 vessels. 100 days. On 1st March 1815, Napoleon and his followers landed on the French mainland at Golfe Juan and headed for Grenoble through the foothills of the Alps, taking the route now known as Route Napoleon. The 5th Regiment intercepted him just south of Grenoble on 7th March. Napoleon approached the battalion alone and called to them, "Here I am, kill your emperor if you wish." The soldiers responded with, "Vive l'Empereur," and joined Napoleon's men. On 14th March, Marshal of the Empire Michel Ney, who weeks earlier had boasted that he would bring Napoleon to Paris in an iron cage, joined Napoleon along with an army of 6,000. On 13th March, the powers at the Congress of Vienna declared Napoleon an outlaw. 4 days later, Great Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia each pledged to put 150,000 men into the field to end his rule. Louis XVI, however, fled Paris for Belgium in the early hours of 20th March after realizing that he did not have enough reliable troops to oppose Napoleon. Napoleon entered Paris that evening. Napoleon appointed a government and introduced constitutional changes, which were approved by plebiscite in May. A Chamber of Representatives was also indirectly elected that month on a highly restrictive property franchise. Napoleon's priority was to raise an army to face the coalition, but the law did not allow conscription, and he was only able to raise about 300,000 men, mostly raw recruits and National Guards. On 12th June, Napoleon led about 124,000 men, known as the Army of the North, into Belgium, aiming to drive a wedge between Wellington's army of 112,000 British, German and Dutch troops and Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher's force of 130,000 Prussians and Saxons. After engagements at the Battle of Ligny and Battle of Quatre Bras, Napoleon confronted Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo on 18th June. Wellington's army withstood repeated attacks by the French until, late in the afternoon, Blücher's Prussians arrived in force on Napoleon's right flank. The coalition forces broke through Napoleon's lines, inflicting a devastating defeat. Napoleon returned to Paris and found that the legislature had turned against him. Realizing that his position was untenable, he abdicated on 22nd June in favor of his son. He left Paris 3 days later and settled at Josephine's former palace in Château de Malmaison. By 28th June, the Prussian army was at Senlis, just north of Paris. When Napoleon heard that Prussian troops had orders to capture him dead or alive, he fled to Rochefort, Charente-Maritime, considering an escape to the United States. However, when he found that British ships were blockading the port, he surrendered to Frederick Lewis Maitland on HMS Bellerophon on 15th of July 1815. Exile on St. Helena. Napoleon was held in British custody and transferred to the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean, 1,870 kilometers, 1,010 nmi, from the west coast of Africa. Napoleon and 27 followers arrived at Jamestown in October 1815 on board HMS Northumberland. The prisoner was guarded by a garrison of 2,100 soldiers, while a squadron of 10 ships continuously patrolled the waters to prevent escape. In the following years, there were rumors of escape plots, but no serious attempts were ever made. Napoleon stayed for 2 months at a pavilion in Briars before he was moved to Longwood House, a 40-room wooden bungalow. The location and interior of the house were damp, windswept, rat-infested, and unhealthy. The Times published articles insinuating the British government was trying to hasten his death. Napoleon often complained of his living conditions in letters to the island's governor Hudson Lowe, while his attendants complained of colds, catarrhs, damp floors, and poor provisions. Napoleon insisted on imperial formality. When he held a dinner party, men were expected to wear military dress, and women appeared in evening gowns and gems. It was an explicit denial of the circumstances of his captivity. he formally received visitors, read and dictated his memoirs and commentaries on military campaigns. He studied English under Emmanuel, Comte de Las Cases, for a few months, but gave up as he was poor at languages. Napoleon circulated reports of poor treatment in the hope that public opinion would force the Allies to revoke his exile on St. Helena. Under instructions from the government, Low cut Napoleon's expenditure, refused to recognize him as a former emperor, and made his supporters sign a guarantee they would stay with him indefinitely. Accounts of Napoleon's treatment led in March 1817 to a debate in the British Parliament where Henry Vassall Fox, 3rd Baron Holland, made a call for a public inquiry. In mid-1817, Napoleon's health worsened. His physician, Barry O'Meara, diagnosed chronic hepatitis and warned Low that Napoleon could die from the poor climate and lack of exercise. Low thought O'Meara was exaggerating and dismissed him in July 1818. In November 1818, the Allies announced that Napoleon would remain a prisoner on St. Helena for life. When he learnt the news, he became depressed and more isolated, spending longer periods in his rooms, which further undermined his health. Much of his entourage left St. Helena, including Las Cases in December 1816, General Gaspard Gourgaud in March 1818, and Albine de Montholon, who was possibly Napoleon's lover, in July 1819. In September 1819, 2 priests and the physician, François Carlo Antomarchi, joined Napoleon's retinue. Death. Napoleon's health continued to worsen, and in March 1821, he was confined to bed. In April, he wrote 2 wills declaring that he had been assassinated by the English oligarchy, that the Bourbons would fall, and that his son would rule France. He left his fortune to 97 legatees and asked to be buried by the Seine. On 3rd May, he was given the last rites, but could not take communion due to his illness. He died on 5th May 1821, at age 51. His last words, variously recorded by those present, were either France, l'armée, tête d'armée, Joséphine, France, the army, head of the army, Joséphine, or qui recule, à la tête d'armée, who retreats, at the head of the army, or France, my son, the army. Antomarchi and the British wrote separate autopsy reports, each concluding that Napoleon had died of internal bleeding caused by stomach cancer, the disease that had killed his father. A later theory, based on high concentrations of arsenic found in samples of Napoleon's hair, held that Napoleon had died of arsenic poisoning. However, subsequent studies also found high concentrations of arsenic in hair samples from Napoleon's childhood and from his son and Josephine. Arsenic was widely used in medicines and products such as hair creams in the 19th century. A 2021 study by an international team of gastrointestinal pathologists once again concluded that Napoleon died of stomach cancer. Napoleon was buried with military honors in the Valley of the Geraniums. Napoleon's heart and intestines were removed and sealed inside his coffin. Napoleon's penis was allegedly removed during the autopsy and sold and exhibited. In 1840, the British government gave Louis-Philippe III permission to return Napoleon's remains to France. Napoleon's body was exhumed and found to be well preserved as it had been sealed in 4 coffins, 2 of metal and 2 of mahogany, and placed in a masonry tomb. On 15th of December 1840, a state funeral was held in Paris with 700,000 to 1,000 attendees who lined the route of the funeral procession to the chapel of Les Invalides. The coffin was later placed in the cupola in Saint-Jérôme's chapel, where it remained until Napoleon's tomb, designed by Louis Visconti, was completed. In 1861, during the reign of Napoleon III, his remains were entombed in a sarcophagus in the crypt under the dome at Les Invalides. Religion, religious beliefs. Napoleon was baptized in Ajaccio on 21st of July 1771 and raised a Roman Catholic. He began to question his faith at age 13 while at Brienne. Biographers have variously described him from that time as a deist, a follower of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's natural religion, or a believer in destiny. He consistently expressed his belief in a god or creator. He understood the power of organized religion in social and political affairs, and later sought to use it to support his regime. His attitude to religion is often described as utilitarian. In 1800 he stated, "It was by making myself a Catholic that I won the war in the Vendée, by making myself a Muslim that I established myself in Egypt." by making myself an ultramontane that I turned men's hearts towards me in Italy. If I were to govern a nation of Jews, I would rebuild the Temple of Solomon. Napoleon had a civil marriage with Josephine in 1796, and at the Pope's insistence, a private religious ceremony with her the day before his coronation as emperor in 1804. This marriage was annulled by tribunals under Napoleon's control in January 1810. In April 1810, Napoleon married Austrian Princess Marie-Louise in a Catholic ceremony. Napoleon was excommunicated by the Pope through the Bull Quam Memoranda in 1809. His will in 1821 stated, "I die in the apostolical Roman religion, in the bosom of which I was born, more than 50 years since." Napoleon read the Quran in translation and had an interest in Islam and the Orient. He also defended Muhammad, a great man, against Voltaire's Mahomet, Concordat. Seeking national reconciliation between revolutionaries and Catholics, Napoleon and Pope Pius VII agreed to the Concordat of 1801. The agreement recognized the Catholic Church as the majority church of France, and in return, the Church recognized Napoleon's regime, undercutting much of the ground from royalists. The Concordat confirmed the seizure of church lands and endowments during the Revolution, but reintroduced state salaries for the clergy. The government also controlled the nomination of bishops for investiture by the Pope. Bishops and other clergy were required to swear an oath of loyalty to the regime. When the Concordat was published on 8th of April 1802, Napoleon presented another set of laws called the Organic Articles, which further increased state control over the French Church. Similar arrangements were made with the Church in territories controlled by Napoleon, especially in Italy and Germany. Arrest of Pope Pius VII. Napoleon progressively occupied and annexed the Papal States from 1805. When he annexed Rome in May 1809, the Pope excommunicated him the following month. In July, French officials arrested the Pope in the Vatican and exiled him to Savona. In 1812, the pontiff was transferred to the Palace of Fontainebleau in France. In January 1813, Napoleon pressured the Pope to sign a new Concordat of Fontainebleau, which was soon repudiated by the pontiff. The Pope was not released until 1814, religious emancipation. In February 1795, the National Convention proclaimed religious equality for France's Protestant churches and other religions. In April 1802, Napoleon published laws increasing state control of Calvinist congregations and Lutheran directories, with their pastors to be paid by the state. With Napoleon's military victories, formal religious equality and civil rights for religious minorities spread to the conquered territories and satellite states, although their implementation varied with the local authorities. Jews in France had been granted full civil rights in September 1791 and religious equality in 1795. The revolutionary and Napoleonic regimes abolished Jewish ghettos in the territories they conquered. Napoleon wished to assimilate Jews into French society and convened an assembly of Jewish notables in 1806 to that end. In 1807, he summoned a Sanhedrin to adapt the law of Moses to those of the empire. An imperial decree of March 1808 organized Jewish worship into consistories, limited usury, and encouraged Jews to adopt a family name, intermarriage, and civil marriage and divorce. Jews, however, were still subject to discrimination in many parts of the empire and satellite states. Personality. Peter Geil wrote in 1947, "It is impossible that two historians, especially two historians living in different periods, should see any historical personality in the same light. There is no dispute that Napoleon was ambitious, although commentators disagree on whether his ambition was mostly for his own power and glory or for the welfare of France. Historians agree that Napoleon was highly intelligent with an excellent memory and was a superior organizer who could work efficiently for long hours. In battle, he could rapidly dictate a series of complex commands to his subordinates, keeping in mind where major units were expected to be at each future point. He was an inspiring leader who could obtain the best from his soldiers and subordinates." Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, said his presence on the battlefield was worth 40,000 soldiers. He could charm people when he needed to, but could also publicly humiliate them, and was known for his rages when his plans were frustrated. The historian Frank McLean sees him as a misogynist with a cruel streak which he often inflicted on women, children, and animals. There is debate over whether Napoleon was an outsider who never felt at home in France or with other people. Hippolyte Taine said Napoleon saw others only as instruments and was cut off from feelings of admiration, sympathy, or pity. Arthur Levy replied that Napoleon genuinely loved Josephine and often showed humanity and compassion to his enemies or those who had let him down. He had the normal middle-class virtues and understood the common man. Historians are divided over whether Napoleon was consistently ruthless when his power was threatened or surprisingly indulgent in some cases. Those arguing for a ruthless personality point to episodes such as his violent suppression of revolts in France and conquered territories, his execution of the Duc d'Enghien and plotters against his rule, and his massacre of Turkish prisoners of war in Syria in 1799. Others point to his mild treatment of disloyal subordinates such as Bernadotte, Talleyrand, and Fouché. Many historians see Napoleon as pragmatic and a realist, at least in the early years of his rule. He was not driven by ideology and promoted capable men irrespective of their political and social background, as long as they were loyal. As an expert in military matters, he valued technical expertise and listened to the advice of experts in other fields. However, there is a consensus that once he dominated Europe, he became more intolerant of other views and surrounded himself with yes men. Towards the end of his reign, he lost his realism and ability to compromise. Some historians talk of Napoleon's dual nature, a rationalist with a strong romantic streak. He took a team of scholars, artists, and engineers with him to Egypt in order to scientifically study the country's culture and history, but at the same time was struck by romantic Orientalism. "I was full of dreams," he stated. "I saw myself founding a religion, marching into Asia, riding an elephant, a turban on my head, and in my hand, a new Quran that I would have composed to suit my need." Napoleon was superstitious. He believed in omens, numerology, fate, and lucky stars, and always asked of his generals, "Is he lucky?" Dwyer states that Napoleon's victories at Austerlitz and Jena in 1805-06 left him even more certain of his destiny and invincibility. "I am of the race that founds empires," he once boasted, deeming himself an heir to the ancient Romans. Various psychologists have attempted to explain Napoleon's personality. Alfred Adler cites Napoleon to describe an inferiority complex, in which short people adopt over-aggressive behavior to compensate for lack of height. This inspired the term Napoleon complex. Adler, Erich Fromm, and Wilhelm Reich ascribe his nervous energy to sexual dysfunction. Harold T. Parker speculated that rivalry with his older brother and bullying when he moved to France led him to develop an inferiority complex, which made him domineering. Appearance and image. In his youth, Bonaparte was consistently described as small and thin. Johann Ludwig Fürstenberger, who accompanied him in 1797 and 1798, notes, "Bonaparte was rather slight and emaciated-looking. His face, too, was very thin, with a dark complexion. His black, unpowdered hair hung down evenly over both shoulders. But that, despite his slight and unkempt appearance, his looks and expression were earnest and powerful." The English painter Joseph Farrington, who met him in 1802, said Bonaparte's eyes were lighter and more of a grey than I should have expected from his complexion. His person is below middle size, and his general aspect was milder than I had before thought it. In his later years, Napoleon gained weight and had a sallow complexion. The novelist Paul de Kock, who saw him in 1811, called Napoleon yellow, obese, and bloated. He is often portrayed wearing a large bicorn hat, sideways, with a hand-in-waistcoat gesture, a reference to the painting produced in 1812 by Jacques-Louis David. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British press depicted Napoleon as a dangerous tyrant, poised to invade. A nursery rhyme warned children that he ate naughty people, the bogeyman. He was mocked as a short-tempered small man and was nicknamed Little Boney in a strong fit. In fact, at about 168 cm, 5 ft 6 in, he was of average height. Reforms. Napoleon instituted numerous reforms, many of which had a lasting influence on France, Europe, and the world. He reformed the French administration, codified French law, implemented a new education system, and established the first French central bank, the Banque de France. He negotiated the Concordat of 1801 with the Catholic Church, which sought to reconcile the majority Catholic population to his regime. It was presented alongside the Organic Articles, which regulated public worship in France. He also implemented civil and religious equality for Protestants and Jews. In May 1802, he instituted the Legion of Honor to encourage civilian and military achievements. The order is still the highest decoration in France. He introduced 3 French constitutions, culminating in the reintroduction of a hereditary monarchy and nobility. Administration. Napoleon introduced a series of centralizing administrative reforms soon after taking power. In 1800, he established prefects appointed to run France's regional departments, sub-prefects to run districts and mayors to run towns. Local representative bodies were retained, but their powers were reduced, and indirect elections with a high property qualification replaced direct elections. Real power in the regions was now in the hands of the prefects, who were judged by how they met the main priorities of Napoleon's government: efficient administration, law and order, stimulating the local economy, gathering votes for plebiscites, conscripting soldiers and provisioning the army. An enduring reform was the foundation, in December 1799, of the Council of State, an advisory body of experts which could also draft laws for submission to the legislative body. Napoleon drew many of his ministers and ambassadors from the council. It was the council which undertook the codification of French law. After several attempts by revolutionary governments, Napoleon officially introduced the metric system in France in 1801, and it was spread through Western Europe by his armies. The system was unpopular in some circles, so in 1812, he introduced a compromise system in the retail trade called the mesures usuelles, traditional units of measurement. In December 1805, Napoleon abolished the revolutionary calendar with its 10-day week, which had been introduced in 1793. Napoleonic Code. Napoleon's civil code of laws, known from 1807 as the Napoleonic Code, was implemented in March 1804. It was prepared by committees of legal experts under the supervision of Jean-Jacques Régis de Cambacérès, the second consul. Napoleon participated actively in the sessions of the Council of State that revised the drafts. The code introduced a clearly written and accessible set of national laws to replace the various regional and customary law systems that had operated in France. The civil code entrenched the principles of equality before the law, religious toleration, secure property rights, equal inheritance for all legitimate children, and the abolition of the vestiges of feudalism. However, it also reduced the rights of women and children and severely restricted the grounds for divorce. A criminal code was promulgated in 1808, and eventually 7 codes of law were produced under Napoleon. The Napoleonic Code was carried by Napoleon's armies across Europe and influenced the law in many parts of the world. Alfred Cobbin describes it as the most effective agency for the propagation of the basic principles of the French Revolution. Warfare. In the field of military organization, Napoleon borrowed from previous theorists such as Jacques-Antoine Hippolyte, Comte de Guibert, and from the reforms of preceding French governments, and then developed what was already in place. He continued the revolutionary policies of conscription and promotion based primarily on merit. Corps replaced divisions as the largest army units. Mobile artillery was integrated into reserve batteries, the staff system became more fluid, and cavalry returned as an important formation in French military doctrine. These methods are now referred to as essential features of Napoleonic warfare. Napoleon was regarded by the influential military theorist Karl von Clausewitz as a genius in the art of war, and many historians rank him as a great military commander. Wellington considers him the greatest military commander of all time, and Henry Vassall Fox calls him the greatest statesman and the ablest general of ancient or modern times. Cobbin states that he showed his genius in moving troops quickly and concentrating them on strategic points. His principles were to keep his forces united, keep no weak point unguarded, seize important points quickly, and seize his chance. Owen Connolly, however, states, Napoleon's personal tactics defy analysis. He used his intuition, engaged his troops, and reacted to what developed. Napoleon was an aggressive commander with a preference for the offensive. Under Napoleon, the focus shifted towards destroying enemy armies rather than simply outmaneuvering them. Wars became more costly and decisive as invasions of enemy territory occurred on larger fronts. The political cost of war also increased, as defeat for a European power meant more than just losing isolated territories. Peace terms were often punitive, sometimes involving regime change, which intensified the trend towards total war since the revolutionary era. Education. Napoleon's educational reforms laid the foundation of a modern system of secondary and tertiary education in France and throughout much of Europe. He synthesized academic elements from the Ancien Régime, the Enlightenment, and the French Revolution. His education laws of 1802 left most primary education in the hands of religious or communal schools, which taught basic literacy and numeracy for a minority of the population. He abolished the revolutionary central schools and replaced them with secondary schools and elite lycées, where the curriculum was based on reading, writing, mathematics, Latin, natural history, classics, and ancient history. He retained the revolutionary higher education system with grandes écoles in professions including law, medicine, pharmacy, engineering, and school teaching. He introduced grandes écoles in history and geography, but opposed one in literature because it was not vocational. He also founded the military academy of Saint-Cyr. He promoted the advanced centers, such as the École Polytechnique, that provided both military expertise and advanced research in science. In 1808, he founded the Imperial University, a supervisory body with control over curriculum and discipline. The following year, he introduced the baccalaureate. The system was designed to produce the efficient bureaucrats, technicians, professionals, and military officers that the Napoleonic state required. It outperformed its European counterparts, many of which borrowed from the French system. Female education, in contrast, was designed to be practical and religious, based on home science, the catechism, basic literacy and numeracy, and enough science to eradicate superstition, nobility, and honors. In May 1802, Bonaparte created the Legion of Honor, whose members would be military personnel and civilians with distinguished service to the state. The institution was unpopular with Republicans, and the measure passed by 14 votes to 10 in the Council of State. The Legion of Honor became an order of chivalry after the empire was proclaimed in 1804. In August 1806, Napoleon created an hereditary imperial nobility, including princes, dukes, counts, barons, and knights. Eventually, the empire had over 3,000 nobles and more than 30,000 members of the Legion of Honor. Memory and evaluation. Criticism. There is debate over whether Napoleon was an enlightened despot who laid the foundations of modern Europe, or a megalomaniac who wrought greater misery than any man before the coming of Hitler. He was compared to Adolf Hitler by Peter Geil in 1947 and Claude Ribber in 2005. Most modern critics of Napoleon, however, reject the Hitler comparison, arguing that Napoleon did not commit genocide and did not engage in the mass murder and imprisonment of his political opponents. Nevertheless, David A. Bell and Macklin condemn his killing of 5,000 Turkish prisoners of war in Syria. Historians have argued that his expansionist foreign policy was a major factor in the Napoleonic Wars, which cost 6 million lives and caused economic disruption for a generation. Macklin and Corelli Barnett suggest that Napoleon's reputation as a military genius is exaggerated. Cobban and Susan P. Connor argue that Napoleon had insufficient regard for the lives of his soldiers and that his battle tactics led to excessive casualties. Critics also cite Napoleon's exploitation of conquered territories. To finance his wars, Napoleon increased taxes and levies of troops from annexed territories and satellite states. He also introduced discriminatory tariff policies which promoted French trade at the expense of allies and satellite states. He institutionalized plunder. French museums contain art stolen by Napoleon's forces from across Europe. Artifacts were brought to the Musée du Louvre for a Grand Central Museum, an example which would later be followed by others. Many historians have criticized Napoleon's authoritarian rule, especially after 1807, which included censorship, the closure of independent newspapers, the bypassing of direct elections and representative government, the dismissal of judges showing independence, and the exile of critics of the regime. Historians also blame Napoleon for reducing the civil rights of women, children, and people of color, and reintroducing the legal penalties of civil death and confiscation of property. His reintroduction of an hereditary monarchy and nobility remains controversial. His role in the Haitian Revolution and decision to reinstate slavery in France's colonies in the Caribbean and Indian Ocean adversely affect his reputation. Propaganda and memory. Napoleon's use of propaganda contributed to his rise to power, legitimated his regime, and established his image for posterity. Strict censorship and control of the press, books, theatre, and art were part of his propaganda scheme, aimed at portraying him as bringing peace and stability to France. Propaganda focused on his role first as a general, then as a civil leader and emperor. He fostered a relationship with artists, commissioning and controlling different forms of art to suit his propaganda goals. Napoleonic propaganda survived his exile to St. Helena. Las Casas, who was with Napoleon in exile, published the Memorial of St. Helena in 1822, creating a legend of Napoleon as a liberal, visionary proponent of European unification, deposed by reactionary elements of the Ancien regime. Napoleon remained a central figure in the Romantic art and literature of the 1820s and 1830s. The Napoleonic legend played a key role in collective political defiance of the Bourbon Restoration monarchy in 1815-1830. People from different walks of life and areas of France, particularly Napoleonic veterans, drew on the Napoleonic legacy and its connections with the ideals of the French Revolution. The defiance manifested itself in seditious materials, displaying the tricolour and rosettes. There were also subversive activities celebrating anniversaries of Napoleon's life and reign and disrupting royal celebrations. Bell sees the return of Napoleon's remains to France in 1840 as an attempt by Louis-Philippe to prop up his unpopular regime by associating it with Napoleon, and that the regime of Napoleon III was only possible with the continued resonance of the Napoleonic legend. Venita Datta argues that following the collapse of militaristic Boulangism in the late 1880s, the Napoleonic legend was divorced from party politics and revived in popular culture. Writers and critics of the Belle Époque exploited the Napoleonic legend for diverse political and cultural ends. In the 21st century, Napoleon appears regularly in popular fiction, drama, and advertising. Napoleon and his era remain major topics of historical research, with a sharp increase in historical books, articles, and symposia during the bicentenary years of 1999 to 2015. Long-term influence outside France. Napoleon was responsible for spreading many of the values of the French Revolution to other countries, especially through the Napoleonic Code. After the fall of Napoleon, it continued to influence the law in Western Europe and other parts of the world, including Latin America, the Dominican Republic, Louisiana, and Quebec. Napoleon's regime abolished remnants of feudalism in the lands he conquered and in his satellite states. He liberalized property laws, ended manorialism, abolished the Guild of Merchants and Craftsmen to facilitate entrepreneurship, legalized divorce, closed the Jewish ghettos, and ended the Spanish Inquisition. The power of church courts and religious authority was sharply reduced, and equality before the law was proclaimed for all men. Napoleon reorganized what had been the Holy Roman Empire, made up of about 300 Kleinstaaterei, into a more streamlined 40-state confederation of the Rhine. This helped promote the German Confederation and the unification of Germany in 1871, as it sparked a new wave of German nationalism that opposed the French intervention. The movement toward Italian unification was similarly sparked by Napoleonic rule. These changes contributed to the development of nationalism and the nation-state. The Napoleonic invasion of Spain and ousting of the Spanish Bourbon monarchy had a significant effect on Spanish America. Many local elites sought to rule in the name of Ferdinand VII, whom they considered the legitimate monarch. Napoleon indirectly began the process of Latin American independence when the power vacuum was filled by local political leaders, such as Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín. Such leaders embraced nationalistic sentiments influenced by French nationalism and led successful independence movements in Latin America. Napoleon's reputation is generally favorable in Poland, which is the only country in the world to evoke him in its national anthem, "Poland is not yet lost." Children. Napoleon married Josephine in 1796, but the marriage produced no children. In 1806, he adopted his stepson, Eugène de Beauharnais, and his second cousin, Stéphanie de Beauharnais, and he arranged dynastic marriages for them. Napoleon's marriage to Marie-Louise produced one child, Napoleon Francis Joseph Charles, Napoleon II, known from birth as the King of Rome. When Napoleon abdicated in 1815, he named his son his successor as Napoleon II, but the Allies refused to recognize him. He was awarded the title of the Duke of Reichstadt in 1818 and died of tuberculosis aged 21 with no children. Napoleon acknowledged one illegitimate son, Charles Léon by Éléonore Denuel de la Plaine. Alexandra Kolona Walewski, the son of his Polish mistress Maria Walewska, was also widely known to be his child, as DNA evidence has confirmed. He may have had further illegitimate offspring. That's the complete article. If you made it this far, you'll love the rest of the channel. Subscribe for a new Wikipedia deep dive every single day. The next video is on screen now, and if there's a topic you want narrated, drop it in the comments. Thanks for watching.